So, as part of our volunteer training for Catholic Charities, we also go over cultural considerations. So, we're going to be going through some common metaphors for culture, and some of you may have already heard about some of them, and that's great. Hopefully, this gives you more food for thought as you consider this huge nebulous thing that is culture that we kind of interact in and try to figure ourselves out and those around us, whether they be from our own culture or others coming in. So, the first metaphor we're going to go over, and the one we're going to be spending most time taking examples from, is the iceberg metaphor. So, as many of you know, icebergs are kind of infamous for having, little nice peaks above the water and then these huge hulking like bulks below the water that you don't see and carry a lot of weight. So, surface culture, I'll read some of these to you if you don't want to peer at your screen at the little text. I'll do the peering for you, don't worry. So food, dress, literature, games, celebrations, languages. I would argue that language works all the way down through culture just because of how language shapes thought, more or less depending on which philosophy you ascribe to. Anyways, moving under the surface, you have what they are calling deep culture here. Unspoken rules, you kind of know it when it's broken, but it would be difficult to kind of pull a rule out of the air. So these are things regarding maybe courtesy, personal space, facial expressions or gestures sometimes, the relationship to animals, ideas of what's acceptable, parenting and child rearing, attitude toward elders, and then moving even deeper into the unconscious rules that may be very difficult to put words to. And have the concept of self, preference for cooperation, concept of past or future, etc. So, and as you can also see, the emotional level is up at the top is relatively low. So if you have differences of opinion on food, that's usually pretty fine. There's not much emotional attachment to. No, like you must like pickles, otherwise we can never talk. And then moving to deep culture, there's a higher level of emotional, not volatility, but I guess sensitivity to these differences and tensions. And then again, as you move even deeper to the unconscious level, it's very intense emotional load. And so one of my professors has this expression she likes to use about stepping on the big toes of culture, which I think is great. If you've ever been in a conversation with students or someone and all of a sudden you find yourself being defensive or feeling affronted and you don't necessarily know why, it could be that they've accidentally stepped on one of your big toes of culture and you're not necessarily aware of what they stepped on or why, because it's a more unconscious or unspoken rule. It's hard to articulate in yourself, but you're definitely feeling that. So yeah, that's just something to be aware of that happens. So, or also vice versa, like looking for signs of, oh gosh, did I, step on their toes without realizing it. So, so moving on to examples from the top of the iceberg, we have celebrations. So, as you can see, we have, I want to say November because that's the word that's right in front of me, but I want to say Thanksgiving. So we have the American Thanksgiving and we also have the American Independence Day. As you can probably guess, there are different Thanksgivings around the world. To list a few, we have these nice lists and columns that I had a lot of trouble formatting for some reason. So, and then the implication for our classes and interacting with our students is maybe not start off class in November talking about, so this is a really specially American thing that we do, and we, pilgrims and pumpkins are the only way. Obviously, I don't think any of you would do that, but just to kind of play it up for sake of making a point, which is explicit communication, which we will talk about later, because cultures tend to vary in explicit or implicit. Or so just talking about, so what are you thankful for? Or if you're in a lower level class, maybe just even practicing that initial TH sound, thank you. And really getting that down because that's a sound a lot of languages do not have at the beginning of words. So just some ideas and thoughts to ponder. And then Independence Day, ours is obviously July 4th, but we are not the only ones that celebrate an Independence Day, even more so than Thanksgiving. Here is a useful dandy map, which is cited in the PowerPoint. If you're interested, I can get you the link because it's a cool site that has a lot of flags and maps and visuals and demographics. Anyways, So you have the countries or regions that won independence and what country they won independence from here on this map. So at the time of this recording, actually, it was recently the Ukrainian Independence Day. And so is it better to, so this is something that was difficult in our classes, like whether or not to, or how to address that, I guess. Like, do you focus on the sense of maybe loss or confusion or sadness, or do you just ignore it completely? So that's something to um, consider when working with refugees. A lot of them have been through very difficult things, and so the idea that fostering a solid and safe relationship can open the pathway to these more difficult conversations. So moving on, going a bit farther down in the iceberg, there's attitude towards animals. So this is something that was one of those I know it in my head that my students and I differ culturally on animals, but like just kind of interacting over that value was interesting. Thankfully, this is a kind of a lighthearted example. My students are asking me, so teacher, like, do you have any kids? And I'm just like, oh, no, not yet, but I have a kitten. And I held her up. This is my kitten. This is Selena. And they're like, oh, no, teacher, that's not a child. Like, you're silly. So obviously, some people take being a dog mom or a cat mom more seriously. And so that could have been an occasion where the students may have affronted me without realizing it, etc. So, and then also certain animals. So like cows in Hinduism or pork in Islam and Judaism, I believe, and probably some others are kind of, off limits, known as unclean, and or in the case of Islam and Judaism, or I believe in Hinduism, cows are sacred. So we don't eat them. So the example I want to make then is I don't eat my cat, and other people don't eat cows or pigs for different reasons completely, but it's the same surface form, the same surface. So like going back to that iceberg, same surface result, but different underlying reasons. So it's kind of a clunky example, but thanks for sticking with me. I believe that you're smart and you can understand it. So, and then moving a bit lower into the iceberg, the concept of self, and this is actually an example from language and etymology. So the kind of history of words. So I just like the idea of how deeply language kind of trickles down into culture and self. Anyways, this is the Chinese first person pronoun. 我 means I, me, my, myself, mine, depending on context. And so essentially the old poetical form was derived from the part of we that is not king. So to me, that really illustrates the part of we, so the collectivism that we see in a lot of Eastern or any culture that's, we fall pretty far as Americans on the individualist scale, but and Chinese are kind of higher up towards collectivism in general. The part of we that is not king, so that also shows how separate they thought of themselves from the authority structure, if we want to broaden it out besides the monarchy. So the veneration of, well, ancestors, I guess, but more the mandate of heaven, how strongly they view the power that authority has. So, and again, these are generalizations. So we're going to be talking about that later, the difference between generalization and a stereotype. So other common metaphors for culture are lenses. This one is also pretty great. I think it speaks mostly for itself because it's that great. One point that I liked that I wanted to highlight for you is this little dude cleaning. Sometimes, if I have a little smudge on my glasses, I might not be aware of it right away. And so I may have to have either someone point it out to me and just to kind of clean it off and readjust to get a better perspective. So now I have a hair on it. Anyways, so this is also another great metaphor. Feel free to expound upon it as you wish. If you come up with more insights, I would love to hear them. So the mosaic or jigsaw puzzle about how cultures can learn how to fit together learning how to fit together in a cross-cultural interaction. Someone I know told me that every every interaction you have is a cross-cultural interaction. So, and then they made a joke about marriage. Um, and then also the idea of how the relationship of individual to society and or culture and kind of the influence, the flow of influence between individual and individuals and then culture. So like how does culture influence me as an individual and etc. So, and then as Americans, we're very familiar with the melting pot metaphor. And then there's something to be said about melting pot, where not where everything kind of melts together and becomes a cookie cutter or conglomerate, but more a salad bowl where the individual parts make up something bigger. So that's almost more like the mosaic and jigsaw puzzle. And then we also have the kind of unspoken rule book example, which I believe we touched on. So yeah. Moving on, here are just some questions to ponder. These will be available for a download. I might see if I can put them in the description because that's something people on the internet do, but we'll just go through them. So what are some things that are associated with your culture, just off the top of your head? They can be, and these might be some very general or stereotypical things. So some of them might be kind of like what you poke fun at, like, oh, it's America, we have eagles and freedom, like that's kind of poking fun at it, etc. So I have to watch myself to get into some hairy territory. So how would you describe your culture to someone who is unfamiliar? And I would be willing to bet that this is very difficult to do, especially succinctly. And if there's a language barrier, like with your students, you have to choose your words pretty carefully. So, not carefully, but you also don't want to ramble on and on like I'm doing with an ESL and ELL student. So what are some traditions that you had growing up, and to what extent do they kind of align with or kind of poke out around the edges of the culture around you? Are there any cultural norms or values that you identify with in particular, or that you kind of, I'd rather not be associated with that, like, oh, for some reason, I just really don't like bald eagles for some reason. So like, anyways. And then why is it important to be aware of your own culture? So if I had to highlight one question, I think it would be this. It really highlights the self-reflection and the idea of who am I within my culture? How does it shape me? And then that gives you some more foundation for then interacting with others and their culture and all of the kind of layers. So thoughts on some buzzwords. I may not spend a lot of time on these because they're more for your reflection, and they are a bit. I could get into some, some slippery slopes, and I don't want to go on too many tangents and have to record this whole thing again. So, is there a difference between a stereotype and a generalization? I believe we touched on it a little bit. As a blanket statement, a generalization is more of an observation. It allows for new data and outliers to be easily taken in and accepted, versus a stereotype tends to be more rigid and can be kind of used to base more unfair judgments and etc. So I believe we kind of have an aversion to the term judgment, and so one of my best friend loves pointing out, there's a difference between judging to identify, judging observations, versus, judging to discriminate or take action, or judging, to kind of be exclusive. So there's kind of a difference there. And you may call these things different by different names. So the important part is just thinking about the distinctions and, why is it important to be able to identify where our own biases may be. So one of the examples that I heard a long time ago, and I wish I could remember because it was great, stereotypes, generalizations, judgments, discriminations. So if I have a neighbor, and I had great neighbors growing up, but just an example neighbor that maybe is less great. If I had a neighbor who was convinced all Asians are terrible drivers, they're the worst, if I suddenly become, or if I grew up to become an amazing stunt car driver who is, the best ever, that wouldn't necessarily change my neighbor's mind if they're stereotyping Asians and myself as part of that as bad drivers, because stereotypes are more rigid and don't allow for that outliership. they would just write it off as, oh, she's just special, she's an exception, versus if I were to consistently drive every day and be like an everyday good driver, that might shift their stereotype more towards rational center. So versus, generalization. Anyway, I don't think that was part of the comparison. Anyway, so there's an illustration. And then other terms to think about is cultural awareness, cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, and cultural sensitivity. Ooh, and I just realized this S is capitalized and nothing else is, and it kind of bothers me, but we're going to move on because we are stronger than that. So, nobody's perfect, so here's just a little aside. So your students will likely bring their own generalizations and biases, and in some cases, these may take the form of hurtful stereotypes or judgments. So we can all grow in cultural awareness, whether it be, us who may have lived in America their entire life and not had a cross-cultural experience, or your students who have, maybe taken refuge in multiple different countries and, are here for now, for whatever reason. And it also should be noted that not every student wants to become a cookie cutter American or, lose what they feel is part of their identity formed by their home culture. So that could also lead to more emotional reactions and kind of like reactions against that may be difficult to see. So, but taking steps to get to know your students and intentionally have these cultural conversations. Again, this would be difficult at a lower level, but still asking basic questions like about celebrations in the home country. So again, that those surface level iceberg items would be more useful in a lower level ESL class than more advanced class who could maybe have the vocabulary and structures to talk in English about those more emotionally charged and nebulous things. Anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. So taking steps to increase your own cultural awareness can help you lead your students in discussions and also grow yourself in this, because we can all keep growing, and growing together helps foster that sense of community that a lot of students may be looking for. So here's kind of an example. How important is it not to offend someone? So on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate yourself? 1 being like, oh, I could offend people all day, like you could pay me to do it, I'd be so happy, versus 10 would be like, I'd rather roll off a cliff than have someone think I intentionally offended them or offend someone. And like driving might be like, oh gosh, I didn't mean to cut you off. Anyways. So I'd probably be like a 6 or a 7, depending on the day, maybe an 8. But then the question I want to ask is, maybe there's a lot of variation between, in one culture of, like my husband. Someone I know is not very afraid to offend someone, but myself, I'm much more afraid to offend someone, but we grew up in the same culture. So there's an example of our culture, whether you're talking about South Central US or just America in general, allows for a lot of variation between how offensive you are willing to be or not, versus other cultures may not, generally speaking, it may not be a cultural value. The value may not be the same. So being not offensive, saving face is more important in that culture. So, or vice versa. So more direct negative feedback is more acceptable, and beating around the bush is seen as disrespectful. Like if you have a problem with me, then like respect me enough to be able to articulate it well and then bring it to me. So, and then think about if the situations were reversed. If you wanted to go spend time in another culture or had to go spend time in another culture, would you want to learn their values, their norms, or would you want people kind of not pandering to you or trying not to offend you, but would you rather learn their culture authentically, or would you rather have them, kind of both try to mold around each other? And there's not a good answer one way or another. It's preference and situation. So, but just if you do try and bend too much, that could also just lead to not learning. So, so what I was trying to say then, perfect little picture, good job, is there's a balance. So, and that balance is best found through conversation and relationship. So this last section is just some resources and tools. Again, I just want to put a little word in about stereotypes versus generalizations. These may sound like broad statements, and like saying, like everyone in the Philippines avoids confrontation. That's not true. What that dot would then be saying, based on this framework by author Erin Meyer, is that in general, sorry, let me look at the example again. The Philippines culture tends to be more non-confrontational than someone in, I believe it was France. So when these two cultures would overlap, so some Filipino on the far end of the non-confrontational spectrum might get along with a more agreeable person from France. So again, these are generalizations, examples. So what this is kind of getting at to illustrate is the culture sets the acceptable or like the normal range for which in which prepositions are always difficult. So the culture sets the range in which individuals tend to vary, and there are always outliers. And so getting to know your students and where they fall in this or that aspect of their culture is important. So I feel like that was a clunky example. I always have trouble explaining these graphs because they remind me of math. But this book is great. It's actually a business book, like a cross-cultural business tool. And so she's come up with a great way to kind of represent. So again, this is important to represent cultures as a whole, but stresses, like individuals vary within that. So again, that's why you have those kind of, I don't know if they're bell curves because I'm not a math person again, but other categories she lists are communicating, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. So just a helpful framework again to think about what's normal for this culture and where is my student in this. And then it can also be helpful for self-reflection as well. So other resources that we have, these are in our Google Drive for Catholic Charities. So you do have to be an approved volunteer with us to have access to this drive, just due to some copyright things for material we have on there. But these are common countries and cultures that a lot of our students come from, and so we have informational backgrounders on history and religion and maybe reasons for emigration, if you're interested. So it was kind of overwhelming reading through all of these, like, oh, how do I be sensitive to this from this people group, but realize that this people group may not do so well with this over here, but I don't want to offend these people that think this way. So and so the goal in getting you to think about all these possible sensitivities and ways to offend or not offend people isn't to get you tied up in like endless cycle of impossible people pleasing, but more just to help you think bigger picture, and maybe give you tools to talk about culture, not just the specifics. Anyways, so what was helpful for me was understanding that religion, which, like, I know this, but it was helpful seeing it on the map. Religion transcends borders. So, if a lot of these countries have are heavily influenced by Islam, then that can help feel like there are less specifics to meet with, each student from this country versus. So you get the idea. I feel like I'm rambling because it's towards the end of the video. Another great resource is Migration Policy Institute, and they have interactive demographic maps. So if you're curious to see concentration of immigrants and migrants in I think they can even break it down by county and their home cultures, countries, you can see that on, again, that's Migration Policy Institute, I believe it's .org. So that is most of our cultural considerations presentation, and I hope I didn't offend you. I'm kidding. I don't It's fine. It was supposed to be a joke. Anyways, I hope you learned things and take care.